Hello, this is Dr. Don Lynch. For many years, I was involved in ministry in the nation of Brazil. I've been to more than 30 nations, but Brazil was a special assignment, one which I had really enjoyed. Early on, while I was in Rio de Janeiro, I was catching a plane to another appointment in a city in the north. I boarded the plane, and I always try to book a aisle seat because I like to have access to move around. And I came to the row where my assigned seat was, and someone was sitting in the aisle seat, even though the seat was mine. I started to call the flight attendant to make an adjustment to the seating arrangement, but I felt like the Lord said, "No, sit by the window." I've learned to hear his whispers and obey his slightest command, and always to my advantage when I listen. So I sat down by the window, and when I did, I looked out across the bay, the beautiful waters. But in the distance, there was a storm on the waters. What a beautiful sight, as lightning was striking and rain was falling, but from our vantage point in the sunlight, a beautiful rainbow formed, and a full rainbow with all its colors dazzling was before my eyes. It was indeed a beautiful moment in a very beautiful place. But suddenly, that rainbow came right up to the window. And I was looking at a rainbow, startling colors, as if it were only inches away from my eyes. And I knew that I was in a vision and God was speaking to me. At that time, I always carried yellow paper tablet, and so I pulled it out, rolled back the pages, and found a blank sheet, began to write, and God immediately began to speak to me. He called me by my name. I'll never forget, he said, "Today, Don Lynch, I make covenant with you as I did with Noah. And if you will do what I've asked you to do in Brazil, I will save your 3 sons and their wives, just as I did Noah." Well, at that time, 2 of my sons were not even married, but I knew God had spoken. He went on to say some things which I have never shared in public before. And he said, "I will make you like a bull in your strength of faith, and I will cause you to be a terror to evil and to those who wish to be your enemies in the spirit. Your strength will be in my promise. But I will test your strength until you are convinced that you are a bull in this subject." I wasn't certain all that God meant by that until about 6 weeks later. My wife and I were in Boa and ministering at a wonderful conference. The first night we came in, and there was a couple on the front row, as I recall, holding a baby. Gorgeous little child, and of course Brazilian people are so beautiful, and the beautiful baby. But my wife went over to say, like girls do, "Goo goo," and "Aren't you cute?" And the mother handed the baby to my wife. My wife took the baby in her arms, and then suddenly we both realized something was happening from the look on the faces of the parent. And in that moment, not speaking Portuguese nor understanding what anyone was saying, because no one was telling us what was going on, I stepped up and put my hand on the baby, and Rethan and I prayed. We did not know that the baby was dying. Having seen every specialist in Brazil, and as I recall the story, they were going to see the next day travel to Sao Paulo to see another specialist, which they believed was their last resort, the last chance they would have, because their baby could not keep down food. He would eat food and the food would come back up. And this had been going on long enough that his life and organs were in peril. We prayed for him, not even knowing the story until later. And God healed that baby. The next morning, he took food, and for the first time in his life, as I understand it, he didn't vomit the food up. And from that moment on, he was healthy. So much so that it was wonderful to see him when we go back many years later, a healthy young child, a miracle of God's healing power. The next morning, we were on a phone call with our son. This was many years ago, more than 16 years ago, and the computer system that we were using in order to communicate was not very good quality, and I had on earphones just to be able to hear it, and my oldest son, John Michael, was saying, "Dad, they say I have leukemia." I said, "What? What?" And the second time he said, "Dad, they tell me I have leukemia." I could hear the words, but I couldn't receive them. I could hear them, but I wasn't hearing them, if you understand what I mean. So the third time I said, "What did you say?" And my son, my oldest son, said, "Dad, they tell me I have leukemia." Now, we had known that John wasn't feeling well and that he had some issues, mostly with molars impacted in his mouth. And in the process of treating these impacted molars, doctors began to realize that there was something else going on. And while we were gone, a day after Rethan flew to meet me, he was taken to the hospital, and there the diagnosis of leukemia was given. Here we were in the most northern part of Brazil, very close to Venezuela, in fact, and we were crushed in that moment by the sound of his voice, our oldest son, our boy. I mean, in many years of ministry, we had prayed for everyone's children, but suddenly it was our son who was hearing the words that were basically a death sentence. And the doctors said that his leukemia was advanced. They would treat him immediately and start the chemotherapy. We were to meet the apostle there for lunch, and of course we did. And when we joined him for lunch, he could see that we were upset, and we shared with him what had happened. He wept with us, the food on the table, a beautiful setting on the river. But we were very hungry. We were weeping, and he was weeping, and he was praying, and we were receiving. And then after a while, he sat back and he said, "Now, of course, we'll get the plane tickets changed and get you back to the United States immediately." And after only one of the sessions that we were to have the Friday night, I said, no, we'll be staying for Saturday and Sunday. And because God gave me a promise that if I would do what he'd asked me to do in Brazil, he would save my 3 sons and their wives. He was amazed, but he agreed. So that night, that Saturday night, I stood up to preach. I don't want to sound heroic, but you need to consider how it feels to maintain your passion and focus when you're not certain if your son is even alive. To do what the thing that God has asked you to do. You see, because immediately I heard those words, "Dad, they tell me I have leukemia." A voice spoke in my ear as the enemy jumped right on my shoulder and whispered, "If you cannot trust the Father with this, what can you trust the Father with?" Now, Satan was challenging my promise, my prophetic promise, he made the mistake of misunderstanding my faith, my strength of faith, my bullheaded faith. He wasn't challenging my promise. He was challenging my trust in the Father. But you see, I believe the promise and I trust the Father. And in the midst of that challenge, my wife and I breathed in and I began to say, our son will not die, he will live. And there was never a moment, no matter what happened, when we said something else, because we had a promise. I'll never forget the anointing that came upon me that night. I stood up and immediately I began to prophesy. Now, I train people to not prophesy babies are going to be born. But I heard myself and watched myself as if God had taken over. I say that carefully because, of course, God did not take over. What happened was I yielded to him, and my trust level in him was so great that I simply did the thing God was inspiring me to do. And I pointed to a woman and I said, you're going to get pregnant and give birth to a son. His name will be Samuel and he'll be a prophet. And I saw her face change, turn red, and she wasn't happy at all. I later learned she did not want to have children, and she could not have children. She had a procedure done so that she would not become pregnant. Then I pointed to 6 other women, 7 women total, and I said, you will get pregnant. I did not know, but all 7 could not become pregnant. The second lady, I said, you'll get pregnant and you give birth to twin girls. But all I know, I prophesied to 7 women. Amazingly, when we returned 6 years later, after the service, 7 women lined up to greet us and to say that they wanted us to meet their children because all 7 got pregnant. The first presented a little boy. His name was Samuel. The second, I saw twin girls peering out around their mother, and she said, here's my little twin girls you prophesied. All of them said, we were so angry because we did not want children, but we are now so happy with these beautiful gifts of God. You see, God was speaking life when the enemy was speaking death. But about 3 days later, before we actually got to our son, and when we did, his neck was swollen. The treatment was focusing in on that part of his body, and there were complications. We were there less than an hour when suddenly he began to choke. And right before our eyes, we watched our son's neck close shut, and he couldn't breathe. His face began to turn deep red and then blue, and I don't want to describe the horrible look that came when his eyes strained so much just to breathe that later they said his eyesight would always be affected, and they had to cover his eyes because of what happened in that moment when he could not get a breath. They quickly rushed us out across the hallways, just across the hall into a room where the family would wait, and we heard his room number being broadcast, code blue. The doctor told me later that he came into the room and attempted to intubate, open up his breathing passages, but it was too late and my son died. I did not know that at the time, but in the room across the hallway, his wife passed out right at our feet, fainted on the floor. The door opened, and a woman came in and sat down. I'd never seen her before, and I'd never seen her since. She was praying in tongues, and then she said, Jehovah Rapha, just like that with authority. I looked at my wife, and I looked back. She was gone, and the door hadn't opened. And I'm certain God sent an angel to remind us of the promise and that God is our healer. At that moment, I put my hands up, and like this, I said, Father, I put my son in your hands. You promised. And later the doctor said that at that time, my son began to breathe again. They were able to intubate him and put him into a coma because God raised my son from the dead. They put him into a coma, but they said he'd been without oxygen so long that they were uncertain if he would be functional, that he in fact might be a vegetable. They did not know the state of his condition. For 3 days we waited, and they said, we're going to bring him out of the coma. And we've tied his hands, and we're not certain he may go into into a seizure. So be prepared, or your son may just be completely non-responsive. But don't untie the restraints because we're uncertain of his condition. I'll forget, as I remember now, that moment when they began to bring him back to consciousness. His hands were tied, and I was standing on his right side, and he was pulling. I could see some movement, and he was coming awake, and he was trying to lift his hand, and he seemed to be fine to me, so I just untied his hand. And when I untied his hand, he reached up, and he had put his thumb like this under the oxygen mask, and he just lifted it up like that, and he said, God is good. And again, we knew our son would not die. The oncologist actually stood in front of us a few days later, and he was not a tall man, and my wife would look him right in the eyes, and he had tears in his eyes when he said, I am so sorry. I have given your son the wrong chemotherapy. He said, I have burned up his bone marrow, and he cannot produce blood cells. He said, I'm sorry. I've killed your son. My wife reached out and took his hands in her hands and said, let's pray for you. Our son is not going to die. So leukemia was not a problem. It was this issue of no bone marrow production, no blood cell production. And this went on and on for a time when they were experimenting and doing different kinds of treatment and blood transfusions and all kinds of responses in his body to the treatments and to the condition. And they said he won't be able to see. Then they said his brain will not be functional. And they said his lungs are burnt. And then he said his digestive system is messed up. His kidneys are bad. At one point or another, every organ of his body, they said, was going to be permanently damaged by what was going on. And then they said, but of course, he's going to die anyway. There is no hope. They said this day after day, week after week, month after month. Now, during this time, I continued to go to Brazil. I would come to see my son in the hospital and leave his bedside and go get on a plane, fly to Brazil and minister, because God said to me, if you do what I've asked you to do in Brazil, I'll save your 3 sons and their wives. And this went on for quite a long time, traveling around, preaching to a nation in revival, experiencing miracles, seeing God heal other people. Even people were healed of leukemia and of blood disorders. And my son's in bed, and I'm 5,000 miles away. And finally, there came a point when they said, we've done all we can do. We have one more procedure. It's never been done in the United States of America, where we want permission to try this on John Michael, your son. Never been done before, and he's going to die, but this is going to help medical science and will help a lot of other people. Would you agree to try this procedure? John Michael said yes, and they said, now, 3 days. In 3 days, he'll be gone. And they said, we're going to completely destroy his immune system. It's not just the effects of the fact that he can't produce blood cells. He will have no immune system, and his white blood cells will actually begin to attack his body. And this is what happened. The big blisters came inside of his mouth, and my son was skin and bones, just nearly a skeleton of a man. And they destroyed his entire immune system and took the immune system and took platelets from my second son, James David. Big old bag of blood came into the room, and we were standing there. I'll never forget. Standing there was a big moment when they said, we're going to begin to inject this blood now into your son, John Michael. I'm going to try this procedure. It's never been done in the United States, and it's not going to save his life, but it's going to do so much to help medical science. And I stood there at his bedside. I'll never forget. I had a ticket in my pocket. I'll never forget the jacket, and I'll never forget how it felt when I put my hand here, and there's that plane ticket to Brazil. And I looked at John, and I looked at his wife and his children, and I looked at my boys, James and Jared, my wife, Ruth Ann. I stood there, and I just felt so empty. Actually, I felt so inadequate that, here's my son suffering. God's able to heal hundreds of people through my ministry, but I had a promise. I had a promise, and I believed it, and I trusted the Father, but I was just done. I just didn't have any more to give. Inside, I didn't say anything in front of the family, but inside I said, God, I can't do this. I can't go. That's my boy. And I'll never forget that moment. God came and spoke to me again, and he called me by name, like he had done in the jet when I was sitting in Rio de Janeiro. He called me by name, and he said, Don Lynch, you can go, but you can stay. You can stay here if you want to, and you can give your son what you can give him. Or you can go like I've asked you to. God said, I'll come, and I'll give him what I can give him. I didn't say anything to anyone, but I said goodbye to my son, not knowing if he'd be alive again when I saw him. I knew I was going to Brazil, to a place remote. I'd have no contact, no phone, no internet. I wouldn't know anything for 3 days. So I went, and I ministered. It's very interesting to experience that kind of grace flow, that passion, the passion of God, to minister to people not knowing if your son was dying and you're not there. I finished the ministry times, got back on a plane. I flew to Sao Paulo Airport, Guarulhos. I'll never forget, I got off the airplane. I came out of baggage. I knew exactly where there was a phone bank, and I knew if I could get to that phone, I'd be able to contact my wife in the United States, and I knew that as soon as I heard Ruth Ann's voice, I would know what had happened. And I dialed the numbers, and I waited a minute, clicks on the line, and finally Ruth Ann came on, and immediately I knew from her tone of voice what God had done. She said on the third day, he began to produce blood so fast that his body heated up, and the temperature of his body became so great. Then the perspiration was so heavy from his body heating up, producing blood cells so fast, perspiration dripping off his fingers, dripping off his body. They had to change his sheets several times because they were soaked with perspiration. And his body began to produce blood at an astronomical rate. And today, 16 years later, my son is alive. He has better health now than he ever had before. And I know that God's promise is true. That it pays to trust God. Now, there are several lessons we learned from this. First of all, thank God for very clear prophetic promises. You receive very strong prophetic promises because you're going to need them. The battle is going to rage, and you use the prophetic promise to wage the warfare. This is what Paul said to Timothy. Having received certain prophetic promises, wage warfare with them. And God had said, I make covenant with you, Don Lynch, but then he said, I'm going to make your strength like that of a bull. And I knew that the strength of God had risen in me to do what he'd asked me to do in Brazil, but also to fight this battle and win this battle for my son's life and for the kingdom and for God's glory. Now, if my son had not lived, I still would have done exactly what God asked me to do. I would trust him, even as Job said, I'll trust him even if he kills me. The many times that I wished I could be the one in the bed, not because I was asking God to give me sickness or suffering, but simply that as a father, I would gladly have taken his pain if he could have been free. Standing on the promise, enduring the process, never quitting. My wife and I never once said anything other than our son will live. Our son will not die. We have a glorious testimony, but we have something as strong, perhaps more precious, the trial of our faith. As James said, we did not try to get out of the process of that trial. We didn't try to get out of the trial before it accomplished everything God's grace would produce. And in so doing, it put something in us. Our marriage got stronger when many marriages would fall apart. Our ministry got stronger in international scope. But many times you would have expected such a disaster to torpedo the entire foundation. We discovered who our friends were, and they're still our friends today. We discovered who those would quit because they didn't think they had a good covering, that if our son could get sick, they superstitiously thought that would mean if they followed our leadership, there'd be sickness in their own homes. We discovered a lot of odd things in the kingdom, but we discovered the most amazing and powerful things in the heart of God. And since that time, we have learned this lesson. It pays to trust Jesus. I wanted to share this testimony with you today because I know there are many people going through things that challenge. If death comes, remember, hell can win no victory in the death of a saint. If your faith stands strong and the promise of God comes true and healing snatches a loved one from the grips of death, you'll know the test of faith in your own life. But if not, it doesn't mean you failed. It doesn't mean God failed. There are great mysteries in the kingdom, but I know this is God's will to heal. It's God's will to save. It's God's will for you and I to have enduring, trusting faith that no work of hell, no work of sickness, no work of demons can overcome nor weaken. If God be for us, who can stand against us? Whatever the outcome, your pathway forward is the same. Let the trusting faith that God is feeding with His strength continue to strengthen in your life. And know that all things do, in fact, work together for good and will produce a purpose. And that all of that's happening in this present situation is a part of our dressing room for eternity. There's a greater stage on which we will stand of enduring eternal life. And what we gain here and present there will be about who we are a lot more than what we did. I'm Dr. Don Lynch. Thank you for listening.